"You can't stay here." The words cut through the winter air like a blade, and Sarah watched as the Apache warrior's face hardened into stone. Snow continued to fall around them, each flake catching the dying light of the fire that had kept her family alive for 3 impossible days. "Please," she whispered, her breath forming white clouds between them. "My children. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. My people have done enough." His voice was final, absolute, and Sarah felt something inside her chest crack like river ice in spring. Behind her, 8-year-old Emma coughed again, that terrible sound that had been getting worse since the blizzard trapped them in this God-forsaken wilderness. But it was the way he turned away from her, as if she and her children meant nothing, as if the kindness he'd shown was already forgotten, that made Sarah's world tilt on its axis. What had happened to change everything so drastically? Just days ago, this same man had carried her youngest son through knee-deep snow, had shared his own food when theirs ran out, had built shelters that kept them from freezing to death. Now he stood before her like a stranger, like an enemy, and Sarah couldn't understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. The storm that had brought them together was nothing compared to the storm she saw building in his dark eyes. How had a rescue become a rejection? How had salvation turned into abandonment? 3 days earlier, Sarah Mitchell had been a widow trying to build a new life for her children in the Colorado Territory. She'd been practical, determined, carrying the grief of losing her husband to consumption, while somehow finding the strength to keep moving west toward the promise of land and a fresh start. She never could have imagined that their wagon would break down in the middle of nowhere, that a blizzard would trap them with no shelter and dwindling supplies, or that salvation would come in the form of a man whose people were supposed to be their enemies. And she certainly never imagined that she'd find herself pleading for her children's lives while falling in love with the very man who was now telling her to leave. The wheel had cracked with a sound like gunfire, and Sarah knew immediately they were in trouble. "Mama, what was that?" Emma's voice was small from inside the covered wagon, where she sat holding baby Thomas while 9-year-old Jacob tried to peer through the canvas. "Just a little problem with the wheel, sweetheart," Sarah called back, though her heart was already racing. She pulled the reins, bringing their tired horses to a stop, and climbed down to survey the damage. The wooden spoke had split clean through. Without proper tools and another wheel, they weren't going anywhere. Sarah looked around at the endless expanse of Colorado wilderness, the mountains looming dark and forbidding against storm clouds that promised snow. She'd been traveling alone with her children for 2 weeks now, following the trail that other settlers had carved toward the promise of cheap land and new beginnings. Her husband James had died 6 months ago, leaving her with 3 children, a handful of savings, and a dream that felt more like desperation with each passing day. "Is the wheel broken, Mama?" Jacob had climbed down and was examining the damage with the serious expression of a boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast. "Yes, honey, but we'll figure something out." Sarah tried to keep her voice steady even as panic began to claw at her chest. The nearest town was at least a day's ride behind them, and she'd seen no other travelers on this stretch of trail. The first snowflakes began to fall as she unhitched the horses, her fingers already numb despite her gloves. She'd heard stories about early blizzards in these mountains, storms that could bury a person alive in a matter of hours. "Mama, Thomas is crying," Emma called. Sarah hurried back to the wagon, where her youngest was indeed fussing, probably hungry. At 18 months, He didn't understand why their world had become nothing but jolting wagon rides and cold nights, why Papa wasn't there to tell him stories anymore. She was reaching for her meager supplies when she heard it, the soft sound of hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Sarah's blood ran cold. Out here, travelers could be salvation or death, and she had no way of knowing which until it was too late. She reached for James's old rifle, her hands shaking as she checked that it was loaded. She'd never shot at a person before, but for her children, she'd do whatever was necessary. The rider emerged from the swirling snow like something from a dream or a nightmare. Tall, dark-skinned, with long black hair and clothing that marked him clearly as Apache. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard the stories, the warnings about hostile tribes in these territories, but he made no aggressive moves. Instead, he sat his horse calmly, studying her broken wagon and her frightened face with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Your wheel is broken," he said in English, his voice deep and unexpectedly gentle. Sarah kept the rifle pointed at him, though her arms were already aching from the weight. "Stay back. I'm warning you." He looked at her children peering out from the wagon, at baby Thomas's red face as he continued to cry, at the snow that was falling heavier now. Then he looked back at Sarah, and she saw something in his expression that she hadn't expected. Compassion. "You will die out here," he said simply. "All of you." And Sarah realized with a sick certainty that he was probably right. The Apache warrior's prediction hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah's arms trembled from holding the rifle, but she didn't lower it. "We'll manage just fine," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. The snow was already ankle-deep and showed no signs of stopping. "My name is Aiyana," he said, sliding down from his horse with fluid grace. "It means eternal blossom in my language, though I know your people would not find that name fitting for one such as me." He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of great gentleness or great violence. Everything about him spoke of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape in ways Sarah never would. "You're Apache," she said, stating the obvious. "Yes. And you are a woman alone with children, about to freeze to death because you are too proud to accept help from someone your people have taught you to fear." The bluntness of his words stung because they were true. Sarah had grown up hearing stories about Apache raids, about settlers found scalped and mutilated. But looking at this man now, seeing the way his eyes lingered on her children with what looked almost like concern, she found those stories hard to reconcile with reality. "Why would you help us?" she asked. Aiyana stepped closer, and Sarah noticed he moved with deliberate slowness, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "Because I once had a family too," he said quietly, "and I know what it is to watch the ones you love suffer." Something in his voice made Sarah's finger ease off the trigger. "Had?" "Dead. Soldiers came to our village 3 winters ago. They said we were harboring stolen horses, but we had stolen nothing. They burned everything, killed everyone." His face remained impassive, but Sarah caught a flicker of old pain in his dark eyes. "I was away hunting. When I returned, there was nothing left but ash and bodies." "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, and meant it. Aiyana shrugged as if it didn't matter, but Sarah was beginning to understand that this man held his emotions close to his chest. "Your baby is cold," he observed. "And the little girl, she coughs like my sister did before the lung sickness took her." Sarah's heart clenched. Emma had been fighting a cold for days, and the harsh mountain air wasn't helping. "She'll be fine once we reach—" "You will reach nowhere in this storm," Aiyana interrupted. "But there is a cave. Perhaps an hour's ride. My horse can carry you all. I can't just abandon our wagon. Everything we own. Everything you own means nothing if you're dead." He gestured toward the darkening sky. "This is not the gentle snow of the flatlands. This is mountain snow, and it will bury you alive before morning." As if to emphasize his point, a gust of wind sent snow swirling around them so thickly that Sarah could barely see her own children. Thomas's crying had grown weaker, more of a whimper now, and Emma's coughing was getting worse. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. Aiyana considered this seriously. "Because you have no choice," he said finally, "and because I give you my word that no harm will come to you or your children while you are under my protection." "Your word. Among my people, a man's word is worth more than all the gold your people dig from the earth. I have nothing else left to give." Sarah looked at her children, then at the storm that was rapidly becoming a whiteout. Every instinct told her not to trust this stranger, this Apache warrior who had appeared out of nowhere. But every motherly instinct told her that her children would die if she didn't. "If you're lying." "I am not lying." Something in his voice convinced her. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. But Sarah found herself lowering the rifle. "What about our horses? Our supplies?" "We take what we can carry. The horses will follow or they won't. That is for them to deal." Ekid. "The wagon will wait until the storm passes." He was already moving, gathering blankets and food from their supplies with an efficiency that spoke of experience with such emergencies. Sarah watched him bundle Thomas in her warmest quilt, his large hands surprisingly gentle with her baby. "You're good with children," she said. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and she saw raw grief flash across his features. "I was to be a father once," he said quietly, "before the soldiers came." And Sarah understood that they were both refugees from tragedy, both trying to protect what little family they had left. The question was whether trusting each other would save them or damn them all. The cave Aiyana led them to was larger than Sarah had expected, extending deep into the mountainside with a narrow opening that provided shelter from the howling wind. He'd been right about the storm. What had started as gentle snowfall had become a vicious blizzard that would have buried their wagon completely by now. As Aiyana built a fire near the cave entrance, Sarah huddled with her children in the warmth, watching him work with practiced efficiency. "How did you know about this place?" she asked. "My grandfather brought me here when I was Jacob's age," Aiyana replied, not looking up from where he was coaxing flames from dry tinder he'd somehow found despite the storm. "He taught me that the mountains keep many secrets, and a wise man learns them all." Jacob, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since they'd left the wagon, suddenly spoke up. "Are you really an Apache?" "Jacob," Sarah said sharply, but Aiyana held up a hand. "It's a fair question." He settled back on his heels, studying her son with serious eyes. "Yes, I am Apache. Does that frighten you?" Jacob considered this with 9-year-old gravity. "Mama says we shouldn't be afraid of people just because they're different from us. She says Papa taught her that." Something shifted in Aiyana's expression. "Your father was a wise man. He died of the lung sickness," Emma piped up from where she was cuddled against Sarah's side. "But he told us stories about brave Indians who helped people sometimes." "Emma," Sarah warned gently, but Aiyana smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "What kind of stories?" "About a chief who saved a lost white family from bears," Emma said, her voice stronger now that she was warming up. "And about an Indian woman who knew medicine and helped sick people get better." "Good stories," Aiyana said approvingly. "Your father understood something many of your people do not, that being different does not mean being evil." Sarah felt a strange warmth in her chest at his words. James had indeed been that kind of man, someone who judged people by their actions rather than their appearance. It was one of the things she'd loved most about him. "Are you married?" Emma asked with the innocent directness of childhood, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "Emma, that's not appropriate." "I was," Aiyana said simply. Her name was Itzel. It means rainbow in my language. "Was she pretty?" Emma persisted, seemingly oblivious to the grief that flickered across Aiyana's face. "The most beautiful woman in our tribe," he said softly. "She had eyes like starlight and a laugh that could charm birds from the trees." "What happened to her?" Jacob asked quietly. Aiyana was silent for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She died with the others when the soldiers came. We were to be married in the spring." The cave fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of wind. Sarah's heart ached for this man who had lost everything, just as she had lost James. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." Their eyes met across the fire, and Sarah saw recognition there, the understanding that passes between people who have walked through the same kind of darkness. "Your husband, the lung sickness?" Aiyana asked. Sarah nodded. 6 months ago. He fought it for almost a year, but... She looked down at Thomas, sleeping in her arms. "He never got to see Thomas take his first steps." "But he left you with strong children," Aiyana observed. "They carry his spirit." "They're all I have left of him," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by them, dragging them out here to the middle of nowhere on nothing but hope and stubborn pride." "Hope and stubborn pride have built more lives than comfort and certainty," Aiyana said. "Your children will grow up knowing their mother was brave enough to fight for their future." Outside, the storm raged on. But inside their sheltered cave, something warm was building between them. A connection forged by shared loss and the simple human need for understanding. Sarah found herself studying Aiyana's face in the firelight, noticing the way the flames highlighted the sharp lines of his cheekbones, the gentle way he looked at her children. He wasn't what she'd expected when she'd first seen him through the snow. He was neither the savage from settlers' nightmares, nor the noble warrior from James's stories. He was simply a man who had suffered loss and chosen kindness anyway. But as Thomas stirred in her arms and Emma coughed again, Sarah wondered what would happen when the storm passed and they had to face the world outside their temporary sanctuary. Sarah woke to the sound of silence. No wind, no howling storm, just the gentle crackle of a fire and the soft breathing of her children. Dawn light filtered through the cave entrance, revealing that the blizzard had finally passed. She sat up carefully, not wanting to wake Thomas, and saw that Aiyana was already awake, sitting near the entrance and gazing out at what she assumed was a world transformed by snow. "How long did it last?" she asked quietly. 2 days, he replied without turning around. "You slept much of yesterday." 2 days. Sarah felt a flutter of panic. "Our wagon? We'll be fine. Snow preserves as well as it destroys." Now he did turn to look at her, and she noticed dark circles under his eyes. "You needed the rest, all of you." He was right. For the first time in months, Sarah felt genuinely rested. The constant worry and travel had been wearing her down more than she'd realized, and even their current uncertain situation couldn't quite overshadow the relief of simply being warm and safe. "You didn't sleep," she observed. Aiyana shrugged. "Someone had to keep watch." "Watch for what? The storm's over." "Storms are not the only danger in these mountains." His expression grew serious. There are men, white men, who hunt my people for bounty. They would not hesitate to kill a woman and children if they thought you had been contaminated by Apache contact. The casual way he said it made Sarah's blood run cold. You mean there are people who would hurt us just for being with you? Some of your people believe that any white person who consorts with Indians has become a savage themselves. They shoot first and ask questions later. Aiyana's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah caught the bitter edge underneath. It is one reason I should not have helped you. But you did help us. Yes, and now we must deal with the consequences. Emma chose that moment to wake up, stretching and yawning like a kitten. Mama, is the storm over? Yes, sweetheart. How are you feeling? Better. My chest doesn't hurt as much. Emma looked around the cave with interest, then focused on Aiyana. Did you really stay awake all night watching for bad people? Emma, Sarah started, but Aiyana answered seriously. Yes, it is what a man does to protect his guests. Something in the way he said guests made Sarah think he'd been about to use a different word. Family, perhaps, or tribe. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead, it sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Jacob woke up more gradually, sitting up and immediately scanning the cave as if checking that everyone was still there. Since his father's death, he'd taken on the role of protector with heartbreaking seriousness. Are we going back to the wagon today? He asked. We'll see what we find, Aiyana said. But first, we need food. He produced several small packages from his pack, dried meat, some kind of flat bread, and berries that had been preserved in fat. It was unlike anything Sarah had eaten before, but it was nourishing and filling, and her children ate without complaint. This is good, Emma declared, chewing thoughtfully on the dried meat. What kind of animal is it? Deer, Aiyana replied. I hunted it 3 days ago, before the storm. You hunt with a bow? Jacob asked, his eyes lighting up with boyish interest. Sometimes with a rifle, like your people use. Aiyana's mouth quirked up slightly. Tools are tools. A wise hunter uses whatever works best. Papa was going to teach me to hunt, Jacob said quietly, before he got sick. It is a good skill to have, Aiyana agreed. Perhaps while we wait for the snow to melt enough for travel, I could show you some things. Sarah felt her throat tighten. James had indeed promised to teach Jacob to hunt and track, to help him become the kind of man who could provide for a family. It was one of many promises that death had made impossible to keep. Would you really? Jacob asked eagerly. If your mother agrees. All eyes turned to Sarah. The practical part of her mind said it would be useful for Jacob to learn such skills. The fearful part worried about her son becoming too attached to a man who would eventually disappear from their lives. But looking at Jacob's hopeful face, she found herself nodding. I think that would be very kind of you. Aiyana smiled, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. Then it is settled. But first, we should see what the storm has left us to work with. He rose and walked to the cave entrance, and Sarah followed. What she saw outside took her breath away. The world had been transformed into something magical and terrible. Snow lay 4 feet deep in places, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. Trees were bent and broken under the weight of ice, and in the distance she could see no sign of their wagon at all. How will we ever find it under all that? She asked. We will find it, Aiyana said with quiet confidence. But it may take some time to dig it out. Time. How much time did they have before people came looking for them? Before someone noticed a white woman traveling with an Apache and decided to take action? Sarah looked at her children, warm and fed and safe for the moment, then at the man who had saved their lives. Time suddenly seemed like the most precious commodity in the world. 3 hours of digging through snow that seemed to have swallowed their entire world, and they finally found the wagon. It was buried so deeply that only the canvas top was visible, like a snow-covered island in a frozen sea. Aiyana worked with steady determination, his powerful shoulders cutting through the heavy snow, while Sarah did what she could to help, and the children gathered smaller branches for firewood. "At least it's still intact," Sarah said, brushing snow off the wagon's side. The cold air made her breath come in white puffs, and her fingers were nearly numb despite her gloves. "The wheel is still broken," Aiyana observed, examining the damage. "It will need more than we can do here." Sarah's heart sank. "So we're stranded." "Not stranded, delayed." He straightened, considering their options. "There is a settlement about a day's ride north of here. They will have a blacksmith who can repair this, and supplies you will need for the rest of your journey. A day's ride on horseback, maybe, but with the children and the wagon. 3 days, perhaps 4, depending on conditions." Aiyana pulled their salvageable supplies from the wagon bed, examining each item carefully. "We have enough food for that long, if we are careful." "And if we encounter those bounty hunters you mentioned?" Aiyana was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. "Then we hope your God protects fools and children, because we will need all the help we can get." His bluntness should have terrified her, but instead Sarah found it oddly comforting. After months of well-meaning neighbors telling her that everything would work out fine, that the Lord would provide, it was refreshing to hear someone acknowledge that their situation was genuinely dangerous. "Mama," Emma called from where she was helping Jacob gather wood. "Come look at this." Sarah hurried over to find her daughter pointing excitedly at tracks in the snow. "What did you find, sweetheart?" "Animal tracks." "Aiyana, what kind of animal makes marks like these?" Aiyana came over and studied the prints carefully. "Rabbit," he said after a moment. "A large one, probably a snowshoe hare. Good eyes, little one." Emma beamed with pride. "Could we catch it? For dinner?" "Perhaps. Your brother and I could set some snares while your mother finishes gathering supplies." Sarah watched as Aiyana began explaining to Jacob and Emma how to read the tracks, how to tell which direction the animal had been traveling, and how recently it had passed. Her children hung on his every word, asking questions with the endless curiosity of youth. When had she last seen them so engaged, so eager to learn? Since James's death, they'd all been focused on simply surviving, on getting through each day. There had been little time for wonder or discovery. "He's good with them," she murmured to herself. "Your children are hungry for knowledge," Aiyana said, apparently having overheard her. "They have good minds. Your husband must have been a learned man." "He was a school teacher," Sarah replied. "Before we decided to head west, he believed that children should learn about the world around them, not just from books." A wise philosophy. Aiyana showed Jacob how to identify the best spots for setting snares. The Apache teach their children by doing, by watching, by experiencing. Knowledge that lives only in books is like a bird in a cage, beautiful perhaps, but unable to fly when it is needed. Sarah found herself nodding. It was exactly the kind of thing James would have said, though he'd probably have put it in fancier words. As the afternoon wore on, they worked together to make their temporary camp more comfortable. Aiyana showed them how to build a proper shelter using the wagon as a foundation, how to bank snow around the edges for insulation, how to create a fire that would burn efficiently through the night. "Will we be safe here?" Sarah asked as they settled around the fire for their evening meal. "Safe enough," Aiyana replied. "We are still several miles from any main trail, and the snow will hide our tracks until morning. But we should not stay long." Because of the bounty hunters? Because winter is not finished with us yet. He gestured toward the sky, which was growing cloudy again. There will be more storms before spring truly arrives. That night, as Sarah lay wrapped in blankets with Thomas snuggled against her chest and her older children curled nearby, she found herself acutely aware of Aiyana's presence. He sat by the fire, keeping watch again, his profile sharp and handsome in the flickering light. She thought about how he'd laughed when Emma had made a particularly astute observation about the rabbit tracks, the way his face had softened when Jacob asked him about hunting techniques. This wasn't the savage from frontier nightmares. This was a man who understood children, who honored their curiosity and treated their questions with respect. A man not so different from the husband she'd lost. The thought should have felt like a betrayal of James's memory, but somehow it didn't. Instead, it felt like a recognition of something precious and rare. Kindness in the wilderness, gentleness in strength, hope in the midst of loss. But as she watched Aiyana scan the darkness beyond their fire, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful interlude was about to come to an end. The sound that woke Sarah wasn't loud, just the soft nicker of a horse somewhere in the distance. But Aiyana was already moving, his hand on her shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. In the pre-dawn darkness, his expression was grim. "How many?" she whispered. "3 riders, maybe 4. They've been circling our camp for the past hour." His voice was barely audible. "Wake the children quietly. We need to move." Sarah's heart hammered as she gently roused Jacob and Emma, pressing her hand over their mouths before they could speak. Thomas, thankfully, remained sleeping in her arms. She watched Aiyana quickly and silently scatter their fire and gather their most essential supplies. "Where can we go?" she breathed. "There's a ravine about half a mile east. We can hide there until they pass." He handed her a pack. "Leave everything else. Lives matter more than possessions." They moved through the snow like ghosts, Aiyana leading the way with sure, silent steps. Sarah marveled at how he seemed to know exactly where to place his feet to avoid making noise, how he guided them around obstacles that would have left obvious tracks. Behind them, she could hear voices now, rough, male voices speaking in harsh whispers. As tracks leading this way. Fresh fire couldn't have gone far. Worth good money if we bring them all back alive. Sarah's blood ran cold. These weren't random travelers. They were exactly what Aiyana had warned her about, men who hunted his people for bounty, and who clearly considered her and her children contaminated by association. Emma stumbled slightly, and Sarah caught her arm, pulling her close. Her daughter's eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't make a sound. Even at 8 years old, she understood the danger they were in, and the ravine, when they reached it, was deeper than Sarah had expected. A natural hiding place carved by some long-ago stream. Aiyana helped them down into its depths, where overhanging rocks provided shelter and concealment. "Stay here," he whispered. "No matter what you hear, don't come out until I return." "Where are you going?" Sarah grabbed his arm, suddenly terrified at the thought of being left alone. "To lead them away from you." His dark eyes were steady, determined. "If I don't return by sunset, take the children and follow this ravine downstream. It will lead you to the settlement eventually." "Aiyana, no." "You can't." But he was already climbing back up the ravine wall, moving with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. Sarah pressed herself against the rocky wall, holding her children close, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Minutes passed. Then she heard hoofbeats approaching, growing louder. There, fresh tracks leading toward the old mining trail. He's heading for the high country. Damn Apache know every cave and hiding spot up there. What about the woman and kids? They'll slow him down. We'll catch them all before nightfall. The hoofbeats receded, heading in the direction Aiyana had gone. Sarah closed her eyes and sent up a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, for his safety, for her children's protection, for all of them to somehow survive this nightmare. "Mama," Jacob whispered, "is Aiyana going to be okay?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah answered honestly. "But he's very smart and very brave. We have to trust him." They waited in the ravine as the sun climbed higher, as the day grew warmer and the snow began to soften around them. Thomas woke and fussed briefly, but Sarah managed to keep him quiet with gentle rocking and soft humming. Hours passed. Sarah began to wonder if this was how their story would end, huddled in a ravine waiting for rescue that might never come. Then she heard it, a single gunshot echoing off the mountain walls. Emma whimpered, and Jacob's face went pale. Sarah's own heart seemed to stop beating entirely. One shot. What did that mean? Had Aiyana been hurt? Killed? Had he managed to defend himself? The waiting became agony. Sarah found herself straining to hear any sound that might give her a clue about what was happening in the world above their hiding place. But the mountains had returned to their usual silence, keeping their secrets. It was nearly sunset when she finally heard the soft sound of someone approaching their ravine. Sarah gathered her children closer, preparing to fight if necessary, hoping against hope that it would be Aiyana's voice she heard next. "Sarah, it's safe now. You can come out." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it left her weak. But when Aiyana appeared at the edge of the ravine, she could see dark stains on his shirt that hadn't been there before. "You're hurt," she said as he helped them climb back up. "It's not my blood," he replied quietly, but his face was grim. "They won't be following us anymore." Sarah didn't ask what had happened to the bounty hunters. Some knowledge was too heavy to carry, especially with children listening. But as they made their way back to collect their remaining supplies, she realized that something fundamental had changed between them. Aiyana had risked his life to protect her family, had become their guardian and protector in the most literal sense. And she was beginning to understand that her feelings for him went far deeper than gratitude. The settlement of Pine Ridge looked like something from a fever dream when they finally reached it 3 days later. A collection of rough wooden buildings huddled against the mountainside, smoke rising from crooked chimneys, and the constant sound of hammering from what Sarah assumed was the blacksmith shop. After days in the wilderness, even this rough frontier town felt like civilization. "Wait here," Aiyana said as they approached the outskirts. "Let me see what kind of welcome awaits us." Sarah watched him ride toward the main street, noting how he held himself differently now, more alert, more cautious. In the wilderness, he'd been in his element. Here, surrounded by her people, he was the outsider. "Mama, why does Aiyana have to be careful?" Emma asked. "These are good people, aren't they?" Sarah wished she could give her daughter a simple answer. "Most people are good, sweetheart, but sometimes fear makes even good people do bad things." It was nearly an hour before Aiyana returned, and Sarah could see from his expression that the news wasn't encouraging. "The blacksmith can fix your wagon," he said without preamble. "But there's been trouble here recently. A family was attacked by Comanche raiders 2 weeks ago. People are suspicious of anyone who looks like me." "What does that mean for us?" "It means we tell them I found you stranded and helped you reach town. Nothing more. And it means I should not stay long." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're leaving?" "I have to. My presence here puts you and the children in danger." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah caught the flash of pain in his eyes. "Once your wagon is repaired, you can continue to your destination safely. But this is how it has to be, Sarah." The use of her name, spoken so gently, nearly broke her heart. Over the past week, she'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the way he watched over them all with quiet protectiveness, to the sound of his voice telling stories by the fire each night. More than accustomed. She'd grown dependent on him in ways that went far beyond physical safety. "How long for the repairs?" she asked, forcing herself to focus on practical matters. 2 days, perhaps 3. The wheel needs to be completely rebuilt. Aiyana dismounted and began unhitching their horses. "I've arranged for you to stay at the boarding house. The woman who runs it, Mrs. Patterson, she's a widow herself. She understands the difficulties of traveling alone with children." "What about payment? I don't have much money left." "It's handled." "Aiyana, I can't let you." "It's handled," he repeated firmly. "Your husband would have done the same for my family, if circumstances were different." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. In the week they'd spent together, Aiyana had somehow developed an understanding of James's character that honored both men. It was the kind of gesture her husband would have appreciated, practical kindness given without expectation of reward. The boarding house was cleaner than Sarah had expected, and Mrs. Patterson was indeed understanding. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and work-worn hands, she took one look at the children and immediately began fussing over them. "Poor little things traveling in this weather," she clucked, leading them to a clean room with 2 beds and a washstand. "You'll want hot baths and proper meals, I expect." "You're very kind," Sarah said. "The man who brought us? The Apache?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew cautious. "He seemed decent enough, I'll give him that. Polite, paid in full without argument. But you be careful, dear. These mountain Indians aren't like the peaceful tribes back east. They can turn savage without warning." Sarah wanted to defend Aiyana, to explain how gentle he'd been with her children, how he'd risked his life to protect them. But she remembered his warning about suspicion and held her tongue. "I understand," she said instead. That evening, after the children were fed and bathed and settled into warm beds, Sarah sat by the window looking out at the darkening street. Somewhere out there, Aiyana was making camp alone, preparing to disappear from their lives as suddenly as he'd entered them. The thought was unbearable. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Mrs. Patterson holding a tray with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want some company," the older woman said. "And I wanted to ask you something." They sat at the small table by the window, and Sarah waited for whatever question was coming. "That Apache man," Mrs. Patterson began carefully. "How well do you know him?" "He saved our lives," Sarah replied honestly. "Our wagon broke down in a blizzard and he found us. Without his help, my children and I would have frozen to death." "And that's all? Just a rescue?" Sarah met the older woman's eyes steadily. "What are you really asking, Mrs. Patterson?" "I'm asking if you understand how it looks, a white woman traveling with an Indian man, even if it started as a rescue." Mrs. Patterson's voice was gentle but serious. "There are people in this town who would assume the worst, no matter what the truth is. Are you one of them?" Mrs. Patterson considered this. "I've lived on the frontier for 30 years, dear. I've seen good and bad in all colors of people, but I'm not the one you need to worry about." As if summoned by her words, Sarah heard the sound of raised voices from the street below. She looked out the window and felt her heart stop. A group of men had surrounded Aiyana near the stable, and their body language was unmistakably hostile. The confrontation in the street below unfolded like a nightmare Sarah couldn't wake up from. She could see Aiyana standing perfectly still in the center of a circle of 6 men, his hands visible and empty, his posture non-threatening. But the men surrounding him were clearly spoiling for a fight. Sarah, don't, Mrs. Patterson said quietly as Sarah moved toward the door. Getting involved will only make things worse for everyone. I can't just watch them. You can, and you will, for your children's sake, if not your own. Sarah pressed her face to the window glass, straining to hear what was being said. She caught fragments, angry words about savages and what he might have done to that woman and her children. One of the men shoved Aiyana hard enough to make him take a step back. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, but she stayed where she was. Then she saw Aiyana say something that made the lead man pause. The Apache reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a piece of paper, handing it over. The man examined it by lamplight, then passed it to his companions. Whatever was on that paper changed everything. The hostile circle gradually broke apart, the men backing away with what looked like reluctant respect. One even touched his hat in what might have been an apology. Within minutes, the street was empty except for Aiyana, who stood alone under the lamplight for a long moment before disappearing into the shadows. "What do you think that was about?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "No idea, but whatever he showed them, it carried some weight." Sarah didn't sleep well that night. Every sound from the street made her jump. Every creak of the old building made her wonder if trouble was coming for them. When she finally did drift off, her dreams were filled with gunshots and blood in the snow. The next morning brought word that their wagon would be ready by evening. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that they could continue their journey, dread at the thought of saying goodbye to Aiyana. She was helping Emma practice her letters after breakfast when Jacob came running into their room, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, come quick. Aiyana's teaching some of the boys how to track." Sarah hurried to the window and saw an amazing sight. Aiyana was crouched in the dirt behind the blacksmith's shop, showing a group of local children how to read animal prints. Her own Jacob was right in the middle of the group, asking eager questions. "How did this happen?" she asked Mrs. Patterson, who had come to see what the commotion was about. "Young Tommy Henderson went missing yesterday evening," the older woman explained. "His parents were frantic. That Apache man offered to help track him, and he found the boy within an hour, stuck in a crevice up the mountainside, scared but unhurt. So now they trust him. Now they respect his skills. Trust is different, but it's a start." Sarah watched Aiyana demonstrate how to tell the age of tracks by their clarity, how to determine which direction an animal had been traveling. The children hung on his every word, just as her own children had done in the cave. "He'd make a good teacher," she murmured. "He'd make a good father, too," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "If the world were different." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Because Mrs. Patterson was right. Aiyana would make an excellent father. He was patient, knowledgeable, protective. He treated children with respect and encouraged their curiosity. And the world was exactly as unforgiving as the older woman implied. That afternoon, Sarah walked through the settlement with Thomas in her arms, ostensibly to buy supplies for their continued journey. In reality, she was trying to understand the place that had temporarily become their haven. Pine Ridge was a typical frontier town, rough, practical, inhabited by people who had come west to escape something or find something. The kind of place where a person's past mattered less than their ability to survive and contribute. But it was still a white settlement, and the events of the previous evening had made clear that tolerance had its limits. "Mrs. Mitchell?" A man's voice made her turn. She recognized him as one of the men who had confronted Aiyana the night before. "Yes?" "I'm Sheriff Harrison. I wanted to apologize for last night. My men and we jumped to conclusions about your companion." "Did you?" The sheriff had the grace to look uncomfortable. He showed us his papers. Army discharge, commendation for service as a scout. Seems he saved a lot of white lives during the Indian Wars. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. He was an Army scout? One of the best, according to his commanding officer. Tracked Comanche raiders for 3 years. Helped rescue dozens of settlers from raids. Sheriff Harrison studied her face. He didn't tell you? No, Sarah said quietly. He didn't. Now she understood the source of Aiyana's pain, the way he spoke about loss with such intimate knowledge. He hadn't just lost his family to white soldiers. He'd been working for the Army when it happened. He'd been helping track down his own people. The irony was devastating, and it explained why he lived alone now, trusted by neither side, belonging nowhere. "Ma'am, you all right?" Sarah realized she'd been standing in silence for too long. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for the information, Sheriff." As she walked back to the boarding house, Sarah's mind raced. Everything about Aiyana suddenly made more sense. His knowledge of white customs, his fluent English, the way he seemed to understand both worlds, but belonged to neither. But it also raised new questions. If he'd been an Army scout, why had he helped them? Why risk his carefully maintained neutrality for a family of strangers? And what would happen when she asked him for the truth? Sarah found Aiyana sitting alone by the creek that ran behind the settlement, sharpening his knife with slow, methodical strokes. She'd left the children with Mrs. Patterson, claiming she needed to buy thread for mending, but really needing to understand the man who had become so important to their survival, the man whose past was apparently more complicated than she'd imagined. "You were an Army scout," she said without preamble. Aiyana's hands stilled on the blade, but he didn't look up. "The sheriff told you. Why didn't you?" "Because it changes how people see me. To your people, I'm either a savage to be feared or a tame Indian to be pitied. There is no middle ground for someone like me." Sarah settled on a fallen log a few feet away, choosing her words carefully. "Were you tracking your own people?" "Sometimes." His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. "The Army needed someone who could think like an Apache, who knew our ways and our hiding places. I needed the pay to support my village during the lean years. But your family was killed by soldiers from a different unit while I was away on a mission." Aiyana finally looked up, and Sarah saw the old pain flickering in his dark eyes. The irony was not lost on me. "God, Aiyana, I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago." But Sarah could hear in his voice that it felt like yesterday. "Is that why you live alone now? Because you blame yourself?" "I live alone because I have no place in either world anymore. I helped the white man hunt my people, and my people died because I wasn't there to protect them." He returned to sharpening his knife, the scraping sound harsh in the evening air. "I am a man without a tribe, without a home." "That's not true, isn't it? Look at what happened last night. Even when they respect my skills, they don't trust me. And if my own people found me, they would consider me a traitor." Sarah watched the creek flow past, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "What if you didn't have to be alone anymore?" Aiyana's hand stilled again. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that my children have grown to love you. I'm saying that you've become important to us in ways that go beyond gratitude for rescue." She took a deep breath. "I'm saying that when you disappear from our lives tomorrow, you'll be taking a piece of our hearts with you." "Sarah, I know it's complicated. I know the world isn't ready for a white woman and an Apache man to build a life together. But maybe the world doesn't get to decide what's in our hearts." Aiyana set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "You don't understand what you're suggesting, the difficulties, the dangers. I understand that you make my children feel safe and loved. I understand that you honor their father's memory by teaching them the things he would have taught them. I understand that when I look at you, I see a good man who has suffered too much loss and deserves to know happiness again. And what about you, Sarah? What do you see when you look at your own feelings? The question caught her off guard with its directness. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she considered her answer. I see a woman who was half dead with grief and loneliness until a stranger appeared in a snowstorm and reminded her what it felt like to be truly alive, she said quietly. I see someone who's tired of being afraid, tired of hiding from life because it might be difficult or dangerous. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the fading light. If we did this, if we tried to build something together, there would be no going back. People would never see you the same way again. Good, Sarah said with more conviction than she felt, because I don't want to be the same person I was before I met you. That woman was surviving, but she wasn't living. Your children love you already. Jacob looks at you the way he used to look at his father. Emma trusts you completely. And Thomas. Sarah smiled despite the seriousness of their conversation. Thomas reaches for you when he's fussing, like he knows you'll keep him safe. It would mean leaving Pine Ridge tonight, together. If we're going to do this, it has to be on our terms, away from people who would try to tear us apart before we even have a chance. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the moment that would determine the rest of their lives. Where would we go? West. There are places in California where people mind their own business more, where a mixed family might find acceptance. Aiyana's voice grew stronger, more certain. I have some savings, enough to buy land and build a house. You have your wagon and supplies. Together, we might have enough to start over. It would be hard. Everything worthwhile is hard. Sarah thought about her children sleeping peacefully in the boarding house, trusting her to make decisions that would shape their futures. She thought about James and what he would want for his family: safety, love, happiness. And she thought about the way Aiyana had held Thomas when he was fussing, the way he'd patiently taught Jacob to read tracks, the way he'd made Emma laugh when she was missing her father. When do we leave? She asked. They left Pine Ridge in the dark hours before dawn, when the settlement was still wrapped in sleep and shadow. Sarah had spent most of the night explaining to her children what they were choosing, that they were going to travel with Aiyana, not just to safety, but to a new life together. Jacob had listened with serious eyes and asked thoughtful questions. Emma had simply smiled and said she was glad they wouldn't have to say goodbye. Thomas, of course, was too young to understand anything except that the people he'd grown attached to would still be there when he woke up. Mrs. Patterson had helped them pack in silence, her expression carefully neutral. But as they prepared to load the repaired wagon, she'd pulled Sarah aside. You're sure about this? Once word spreads about a white woman taking up with an Apache, there'll be no changing people's minds. I'm sure, Sarah had replied, and meant it. Then you'd better take this. Mrs. Patterson pressed a small bag of coins into Sarah's hand. Call it payment for helping with the washing yesterday. Every fresh start needs a little extra cushion. Now, as they drove through the pre-dawn darkness with Aiyana riding scout ahead of them, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They were burning their bridges, choosing love over safety, hope over certainty. Mama, Emma said softly from the wagon bed, are you scared? A little, Sarah admitted, but good scared, like when you're about to do something brave and important. Like when Papa decided to come west? Exactly like that. The comparison felt right. James had been a man who believed in taking chances when the reward was worth the risk. Building a life with Aiyana was the biggest risk Sarah had ever taken. but also the most worthwhile. They traveled steadily through the morning, following mountain trails that Aiyana assured her would eventually connect with the main westward routes. The landscape was breathtaking. Snow-capped peaks, valleys thick with pine trees, streams that ran clear and cold from mountain springs. It was also completely isolated. They saw no other travelers, no settlements, no signs of human habitation beyond the occasional old campfire or hunting blind. "How far to the next town?" Sarah asked when they stopped to rest the horses at midday. 3 days, perhaps 4, Aiyana replied. "But there's something we need to discuss first." His serious tone made Sarah's stomach tighten. "What?" "The papers I carry. My army discharge, my service record. They identify me as Joseph Crow Feather. That was the name the army gave me when I enlisted. But if we're going to be a family, you need to know my real name." Sarah waited, sensing the importance of this moment. "My mother named me Aiyana, which means eternal blossom, as I told your daughter. But my full name, the name my grandfather gave me when I reached manhood, is Aiyana Itzamna, eternal blossom who sees in the darkness." "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "It's who I really am, beneath all the roles I've played to survive in the white world." He studied her face carefully. "But if we're going to build a life in that world, I may need to be Joseph Crow Feather on paper, in official documents." Sarah understood what he was saying. Even in their new life, they would need to navigate the complexities of a society that might not accept their union. Some compromises would be necessary for practical survival. "What would you prefer to be called?" "By you? By our children? Aiyana. Always Aiyana." The word "our" sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest. Our children. The idea that Jacob, Emma, and Thomas might truly become his, and that they might even have children together someday, felt like a gift she'd never dared to hope for. That afternoon they encountered their first test. A group of prospectors traveling east stopped them on the trail, ostensibly to share news and gossip. But Sarah could see the men's eyes taking in the sight of her and Aiyana together, drawing conclusions. "Afternoon, ma'am," the lead prospector said, touching his hat. "You folks heading to California?" "Yes," Sarah replied carefully. "Long journey for a family." The man's gaze lingered on Aiyana. "Your husband there, he's got the look of someone who knows these mountains." Sarah felt the moment of choice. She could let them assume Aiyana was hired help, a guide who would eventually part ways with them, or she could claim him openly as family. "My husband knows these trails very well," she said clearly. "We're fortunate to have his expertise." The prospectors exchanged glances, but their expressions remained carefully neutral. Western politeness demanded they take her words at face value, regardless of their private thoughts. "Well then, you're in good hands," the leader said finally. "Safe travels to you all." After they'd ridden away, Aiyana pulled up beside the wagon. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. If we're going to do this, we do it honestly. I'm not going to pretend you're anything less than my partner, my equal, my family." Aiyana's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I think I have since that first night in the cave, when you chose to trust me with your children's lives." "I love you too," Sarah replied, the words feeling both momentous and natural. "But there's something we need to figure out." "What?" "If you're going to be my husband, and if your name is Aiyana Itzamna, what exactly is my last name going to be?" The question was practical, but it also represented something deeper, the blending of their two worlds, the creation of something entirely new from the pieces of their separate lives. But as Sarah looked at her children playing happily in the wagon bed, and at the man riding beside them, who had become their protector and guide, she realized she was looking forward to finding out. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the doorway of their cabin overlooking the Sacramento Valley, watching Aiyana teach Jacob how to properly care for their horses. The land they'd purchased was beautiful. Rolling hills dotted with oak trees, a clear stream running through the property, soil rich enough for farming, and plenty of space for the small herd of cattle they hoped to build. More importantly, it was far enough from any major settlement that their neighbors were few and generally minded their own business. The transformation in her children had been remarkable. Jacob had grown taller and more confident, his shoulders broader from helping with the heavy work of building their new life. Emma had lost the fragile, anxious quality she'd carried since her father's death, replaced by the sunny disposition that was her true nature. And Thomas was walking now, toddling around their cabin with the fearless determination of a child who knew he was completely loved and protected. As for Sarah herself, she hardly recognized the woman who had been struggling to survive just months ago. Love had changed her, given her strength she didn't know she possessed, and hope she'd thought was lost forever. "Mama," Emma called from where she was tending their small vegetable garden. "The tomatoes are getting red. Can we pick some for dinner?" "Of course, sweetheart." Their life wasn't perfect. Money was often tight, and building a homestead from nothing was backbreaking work. They'd faced suspicion and occasionally outright hostility from some of their neighbors, though others had been surprisingly accepting. The circuit preacher had refused to perform a marriage ceremony for them, but a justice of the peace in Sacramento had been willing to make it legal, for the right price and with the understanding that they were Joseph and Sarah Crow Feather, not Aiyana and Sarah Mitchell. The deception still bothered Sarah sometimes, but Aiyana had helped her understand it as a necessary protection for their family. In public, in official documents, he was Joseph. But in their home, in their hearts, he remained Aiyana, the man who had appeared in a blizzard and saved them all. "Sarah," Aiyana's voice drew her from her thoughts. He was walking toward the cabin with Jacob and Thomas, all three of them dusty and satisfied from their work. "We need to discuss something." The serious tone in his voice made her stomach flutter with old fear. After so much loss, she sometimes waited for disaster to strike again. "What is it?" "Jacob thinks he's ready to learn to use a rifle properly, for hunting, for protection of the family." Aiyana's eyes were warm with pride. "I think he may be right." Sarah looked at her eldest son, nearly 10 now, tall for his age, with his father's serious eyes and his stepfather's growing confidence. When had he become almost a young man? "He's still so young," she said. "I was younger when my grandfather first put a bow in my hands," Aiyana replied gently. "And this land requires people who can provide for and protect their families." Sarah knew he was right. Jacob was growing up in a different world than the one she'd known, a world where practical skills like hunting and shooting might mean the difference between survival and starvation. "All right," she said finally, "but you teach him properly. Safety first, responsibility always." "I would expect nothing less from my son," Aiyana said quietly. "My son. Not stepson, not the boy whose father had died, but simply his son." The casual way he said it, the natural ownership and love in his voice, made Sarah's eyes fill with unexpected tears. "What about me?" Emma piped up, appearing at Sarah's elbow with dirt under her fingernails and hope in her eyes. "Can I learn too?" "When you're a little older," Aiyana promised. "But first, you need to master the art of making biscuits that don't come out hard as rocks." Emma giggled. "They're not that bad." "They're terrible," Jacob said with brotherly honesty. "Even the chickens won't eat them." As her children dissolved into laughter and playful arguing, Sarah felt the profound contentment that came from knowing she had chosen correctly. Their life wasn't easy, wasn't conventional, wasn't what she'd planned when she'd first headed west as a widow with 3 small children. But it was theirs, built on love and trust, and the belief that family was defined not by blood or convention, but by the people who chose to stand together against whatever the world might bring. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah and Aiyana sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and rose. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up your solitary life for all this chaos?" Aiyana considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I regret the years I spent alone, believing I didn't deserve happiness. I regret the time we lost before we found each other. But this?" He gestured toward their cabin, where the soft sounds of their children's breathing drifted through the windows. "This is what I was meant for. I just didn't know it until a stubborn woman pointed a rifle at me in a snowstorm." Sarah laughed softly. "I was terrified of you." "You were terrified, but you did what needed to be done anyway. That's courage." Aiyana reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "That's how I knew you were worth saving." "We saved each other," Sarah corrected. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Sometimes life offered gifts in the most unexpected packages. Love in the middle of loss, hope in the depths of despair, family in the form of a stranger who chose to care. Their story wasn't finished yet. There would be more challenges ahead, more choices to make, more moments when they'd have to decide whether love was worth fighting for. But looking at the life they'd built together, at the children sleeping peacefully in the house behind them, at the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word, Sarah knew they were ready for whatever came next. After all, they'd already survived blizzards and bounty hunters, suspicious neighbors, and uncertain futures. They'd learned that the strongest foundations weren't built on convention or comfort, but on truth and trust, and the courage to choose love even when the world said it was impossible. And sometimes, that was enough to build everything. If you enjoyed this story of love triumphing over circumstance, please share it with others who believe in the power of unexpected connections. And let me know in the comments, have you ever had to choose between safety and love? What would you have done in Sarah's position?